Wright-Fisher, one related colleague, Steve Evans. As you know, Steve is a renowned probabilist, and one of many things that he works on is population genetics. So he will turn things upside down and tell us about the forward-time view of evolution.
Okay, thanks very much, Yoon. So unfortunately, I get to do the stuff that isn't very visually appealing, right? The forwards in time stuff. There's not trees and things like that. You know, it sort of looks much more kind of analytic rather than combinatorial. But, so, you know, I guess I sort of really don't need to explain why we're interested in these sort of questions that Shishi and Anand have already, you know, talked about the kinds of issues that we're concerned with here, and you know, detecting when selection has been present, inference about historical mutation rates, you know, things about past population sizes, whether there's, you know, been migrations, admixture, that sort of thing. Okay, and so
you said you're going to do forward in time. I mean, I would think that would say that'd be questions about the future in some sense.
No, forwards in time means, you know, in a sense, describing rather than describing how, you know, genealogies sort of evolve going backwards in time. It's sort of, you know, if you start at some time in the past with a given genetic composition of your population, how that will evolve forwards in time.
But I could also start at the present, right?
Yes, I could start at the present and predict things, of course, yes.
That's an interesting question.
I mean, it's, of course, exactly the same thing, yes. Right, sort of prediction rather than kind of inference. No, certainly. And so, you know, in order to do this kind of statistical inference, you know, we sort of need to have some idea of the dynamics by which the genetic composition of a population will change with time when there's things like selection or admixture or population size change occurring. And so, you know, we need some models here. And so, you know, this is kind of looking like the you know, FBI boilerplate that you sort of see at the start of every, you know, DVD, you know, sort of, so you've sort of seen, you know, two versions of this already. And so, you know, this is just a kind of, yet again, an explanation of where the simplest type of Wright-Fisher model appears. Except here, to start with at least, I'll be particularly looking at the case where each individual, which is, you know, individuals, you know, genes, you know, each gene is either of type big A or little a, and then, you know, there's just this idea that we have reproduction happening in discrete non-overlapping generations. Each individual produces some very large number of germ cells of its own type. We're not having mutation here at the moment. And then, you know, there's this sort of harvesting of, or sampling of the N cells from this sort of huge pool that produces the next generation. And so, you know, the way that we're going forwards in time now from generation little n to generation little n plus 1, you know, there's the formation of this gamete pool, and then the sampling of big N individuals from this massive gamete pool. And then there's this sort of little bit of sleight of hand that people, you know, sometimes find a little bit confusing, that out of this story, you know, comes this mechanism that's most easily described in terms of the idea of, individuals picking, parents uniformly at random. Each individual picks a parent at random from the previous generation, with each parent being equally likely. And here we're marking the types, the two types, big A and little a, in solid circles and open circles, just to indicate, sort of what's going on there. And, of course, in reality, we have a picture that's like this one here, and then, which you can just disentangle it to make something that looks a little bit clearer. Okay, and, here, what's going on is, we sort of start at time 0 with a population that has 8 individuals, 3 of them of the solid circle type, 5 of the open circle type, and then as time evolves, eventually we proceed to having fixation, where everybody is of the open circle type. Okay, in this particular realization of the story. Okay, and so, what we have here is just a very simple, at least conceptually, very simple discrete time Markov chain that has, where we keep track of the number of type A individuals. Obviously, that's all we need to keep track of, because we get the number of type little a individuals just by subtraction. And so we have this discrete time Markov chain that I'll call Zn, that has state space 0 up to n. And then the one-step transition probabilities, well, they're just going to be given by a binomial distribution, right? So we have a binomial distribution where we've got capital N trials, and if we think of getting a type big A individual as a success, the probability of a success is, the current number of type A individuals divided by big N, right? And so that's what's going on here in this formula here, right? So this is obviously something that, when big N's not too large, is very easy to simulate. And also, of course, if we want to look at multi-step transition probabilities for a Markov chain like this, we just have to take this matrix Pij and raise it to a power. And, when big N's not very large, that's not hard to do, but, if big N's on the order of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and, we want to raise this matrix to a very high power, again, on the sort of order of the population size, which is sort of the relevant number of steps here, where you'll see significant changes in the population composition, that starts to get to be a numerically rather unpleasant thing to do. Okay. Okay, so, just I've already said many of these things, but if, we're interested in a multi-step transition probability like this, that we go from having I type A big A individuals to J big A type individuals in K generations, then, that matrix with those binomial probabilities in it, we've got to raise to the kth power. And, the K where the scale of K on which interesting things happen is of the order of big N. Okay, so because you want to take a big power of a matrix, you'd like to diagonalize it. And it's not that hard to show that the eigenvalues of this transition matrix P are these numbers here, right? Obviously, 1's an eigenvalue like it is for any stochastic matrix. and then like this. But then you sort of see that, you know, the second eigenvalue is 1 minus 1 over n, and so that gives you an indication that, you know, you have to look at things on the order of n generations in order to see some significant action. But unfortunately, there's no known formula for the eigenvectors, and if you ever hear Warren Ewan's talking about this, he just, you know, sort of says something like, you know, all you young people out there, don't try to solve this problem, right? You know, there isn't an answer, and nobody will care even if you do, you know, is basically. So, you know, so what we'd like to do is, you know, have some sort of approximation for what goes on when big N is large. So, you know, what we have is that conditional on there being, you know, Zn type big A individuals around, Zn plus 1, the number of type A individuals at time little n plus 1, is of course just, you know, because we had this binomial story, it's a sum of Bernoulli random variables that can just take the values 0 and 1, and conditionally these guys are independent and identically distributed with, you know, this is the success probability and this is the failure probability. Okay, so, you know, if you go back to your sort of elementary probability course, you know from this that conditional on Zn, the expected value of this change in the number of big A individuals has expected value 0, and this variance here, right? Just sort of standard formulae for the mean and variance of a binomial distribution. Okay, but now we've got a binomial with a really large number of trials, and so, you know, we're adding up a lot of Bernoulli random variables, and so, you know, we can be a little hand-wavy and heuristic and say this difference in the number of big A individuals given the current number is something that in distribution should be close to a normal distribution with, you know, mean and variance given by the mean and variance that we figured out here, right? So that's sort of what you'd believe from the central limit theorem, that, you know, conditionally this is what the distribution of this increment should look like. Oh, I can do this, can't I? Okay, so now a nicer thing to look at is to divide by n and look at the proportion of the population that's type big A, right? Because now, you know, previously we had a state space 0, 1, 2 all the way up to big N. Now we're sort of putting things on a, you know, a common state space, basically the interval 0 to 1, and so we're just dividing by big N, and so we know that, you know, you rescale a Gaussian random variable by a constant, you get another Gaussian random variable back, and we're just rescaling by big N here, and so heuristically the change in the proportions given the current proportion will be, you know, normal or Gaussian with expected value 0, and this as its variance. Okay, and so another way of saying that is that this change in proportion given the current proportion looks like this guy here, right? The square root of the variance times just a standard normal random variable, right? And normal random variable with mean 0 and variance. Sorry, not a standard normal random variable, sorry, a normal random variable with mean 0 and variance 1 over n, okay, because we've got the 1 over n up here, right? Okay, so modulo this sort of factor out the front here, we're sort of dealing with sort of increments that you know, are looking like they've got mean 0 and variance 1 over n, and they've got a Gaussian distribution, and that's reminiscent of an extremely well-studied stochastic process, namely Brownian motion. So let me sort of hopefully be reminding most of you what standard Brownian motion is, or introducing you to it at the very least. So, standard Brownian motion now is a continuous time stochastic process. So, time here is continuous rather than discrete. And we've got this real valued guy. And it starts off at 0. And then if we look at successive increments of this thing, non-overlapping increments, what we get are independent random variables that have mean 0. They have variance that's equal to the length of the interval that we're incrementing over. And those increments are normally distributed, right? And so in particular, if we increment over an interval that's of length 1 over n, what we see is a normal random variable with mean 0 and variance 1 over n, right? Which, is exactly the sort of thing that appeared here. And so here, approximately what we've got is something that looks like an increment of Brownian motion that's just been rescaled by this factor that depends on the current proportions of type big A in the population. And so what this suggests is, if we look at the population proportions and then speed up time by a factor of big N, right, where big N's the population size, then, in terms of the number of type big A individuals, we're doing this, then, we should be sort of converging off to some stochastic process that's evolving in continuous time that, if you don't know sort of formally what this sort of expression means, it sort of looks right. It sort of says that, the limit, kind of a little increment in the limit process should look like, a little increment in the Brownian motion multiplied by a factor that looks like this, right? And that's, following on from, the discussion that we had before that, went back to the central limit theorem. And so, somewhat more formally, we just sort of integrate both sides, and, this can be all made rigorous, well, to start with, just what this expression means. This is a so-called Ito integral, and so you just need to understand a little stochastic calculus, and then the sense in which the convergence occurs is just, very well understood, convergence in distribution of stochastic processes. And so this object here is what's usually called the neutral Wright-Fisher diffusion. Okay, diffusion is just, probability jargon for a stochastic process that takes values in the real numbers, or more generally in Euclidean space, that moves around continuously, doesn't have jumps. That's what sort of diffusion means to a probabilist. Okay, and so, well, what does that sort of get us? Okay, well, we can just use the sort of, the most elementary stochastic calculus, which is, goes by the name of Ito's lemma, that says, if f is suitably smooth, then we have something that looks like this. Now, if you've never seen this sort of thing before, it's sort of a bit disturbing, because, if you're just used to Newtonian calculus and, which is, in Taylor series, integration by parts, change of variable, right, they're all the same thing, really. Then you just expect that f of xt would look like this, but then there's this funny thing on the end here, and that has to do with, the paths of Brownian motion are sufficiently rough that you sort of have to go to the second term, the quadratic term in the Taylor expansion in order to sort of get a legitimate integration by parts formula. And so that's what's going on here. And but this can all be, it's really just a Taylor series type argument. And so if we take expected values of both sides here, so we're interested in the expected value of some function of the proportion at time t of type big A individuals, given that we started with little x proportion of type big A individuals, then that function will solve this partial differential equation. All I've done here is take expected value of both sides, and remember the expected value of my little increments of Brownian motion, they're 0, right? And so this doesn't contribute anything to the expected values. So when I take expected values, I just get, this stuff and this, and then, I differentiate both sides with respect to t, and it all pops out. So just as a sort of an example of that, suppose I'm interested in this quantity here, right? Which is, I pick 2 individuals at random from the population. What's the probability that they'll have different allelic types? That one will be big A and the other will be little a, or vice versa. Then just using this partial differential equation, you end up seeing that the expected value of this guy, does this, and we just recognize the usual differential equation for the exponential function. And so we see that this guy here, which is the heterozygosity, sort of declines exponentially, right? And that should ring bells because it's just exactly mirroring what happens with going on in the coalescent, that you're having the time that it takes for sort of 2 individuals to find a common ancestor has an exponential distribution. And so this exactly mirrors that sort of backwards in time thing from the coalescent. Okay, so it's sort of not hard to see in this model that, if you let it evolve, I always got to be careful here. Probabilists talk about, stochastic processes evolving, right? And that has, in a sense, nothing to do with, natural selection, that meaning of evolution, right? It's sort of, the way physicists would talk about a dynamical system evolving. So you just let this thing run for long enough, and eventually everybody's going to be of the same type. They'll all be of type little a or of type big A. And so that means that, these limiting proportions, you're either everybody's of type little a or everybody's of type big A. And so the first thing to figure out is, what's the probability that you've fixed in state 0, everybody's of type little a by time t, that when you started out with the proportion of big A's being x, and you have similarly the probability that you fix with everybody being of type big A. Now, both of these guys solve exactly the same partial differential equation in terms of what's going on with the derivatives. That's just coming from what we figured out on the previous slide. But of course, what changes here is the boundary conditions, right? And you sort of have obvious boundary conditions. And one thing that's easy to show is that the probability that you fix in 0 eventually, which is just letting t go to infinity in this, is 1 minus x. So in other words, the probability that you end up with everyone being type little a is equal to the proportion of type little a's that you began with. And similarly, the probability that you end up with everyone being of type big A is the proportion of type big A's that you began with, right? And that doesn't actually need you know, all the stochastic calculus is just a fact that you're dealing with a martingale for, you know, a fair game for people who know that jargon. Okay, now one thing that it's sort of possible to show is that, you know, this sort of thing that we're interested in, you know, the expected value of some function of the current proportion of big A's, given that we started off with proportion little x, well, you know, you sort of have a chunk of mass at 0, a chunk of mass at 1, and then you have the situation that's describing, you know, how the mass is distributed when you haven't fixed. And so this thing here, you know, usually called the transition probability, again, it's going to solve our basic PDE if we look at the behavior in the variable that's taking account of where we started and fix the variable that's taking account of where we end. And if we want to know how this thing behaves in terms of the variable that's taking account of where we end up, well, you just have to work with this, do a little integration by parts, and you end up with a slightly different PDE for that function, where little x is fixed and y is now the variable where all the action's happening. Okay, so, you know, we've got all these partial differential equations, you know, well, you know, how do we solve them? So life would be great if, you know, the answer was, you know, log of sine of x or something like that, right? But unfortunately, it's not. But it's sort of almost as good as that, right? That, you know, remember with the original Wright-Fisher guys, we wanted to diagonalize this big transition matrix. And Warren Ewens tells us that we shouldn't do that, right? That there aren't analytic expressions for the eigenvectors. The great thing here is that, you know, you pass to this limit and you're dealing with eigenfunctions instead of eigenvectors. And, you know, here there are analytic expressions for what these things are. And okay, it sort of looks kind of nasty, but you know, these functions that appear here, you know, they're things that, you know, Mathematica and Maple know about, right? They're not sort of off in some exotic netherworld. And also you see here that, you know, we've got this infinite sum, but, you know, when t's at all large, this exponential is going to be sort of killing all but the first few terms. And so, you know, numerically this is not that bad to deal with. And so, you know, what we see is that the Wright-Fisher chain and the diffusion approximation kind of handles, you know, what happens when big N, the population size, goes off to infinity, and we don't have all things that might be going on, you know, sort of selection, you know, population structure, you know, population growth, that sort of thing. But, you know, in principle, the same ideas apply to handle many of those, you know, kind of extra features that you might want to include. And so, you know, the simplest one to talk about, and the one that I'll talk about first, is what happens if population size varies. So I've used slightly different notation to what Anand had. He had, you know, eta for this sort of factor that was describing, you know, a varying population size. And of course, for him, time was going backwards, whereas for me, time's going forward. But there's still this thing that, you know, he observed, that when you look at it from the coalescent point of view, all you're doing is, you know, speeding up or slowing down the coalescence rates. Here it's exactly the same story, that the relevant stochastic differential equation for the diffusion approximation looks just like the one we had before, except that there's, we're dividing by the square root of the relative population size. And, one way of interpreting this is that we have the same model, it's just that, time is getting sort of sped up and slowed down according to the population size. Increasing the population size slows down the speed with which the population proportion of type A alleles changes, just as observed, from the coalescent point of view. Okay, what about if we have a situation with mutation where, here we've just got two types, and so we've got big A's mutating into little a's and little a's mutating into big A's. And so, we assume that big A's mutate into little a's with a per generation probability like this, and, similarly for little a's mutating into the big A's. Well, you can just go through exactly the same analysis as we did before and see, the change in numbers of type A individuals, the expected value of that condition on the current number of big A individuals is given by an expression like this. And then, if we divide by big N to look at proportions, we get something like this. And the great thing is that we have a 1 over n here, so that, the sort of story that led to us having this kind of nice continuous limit, as we did before, holds. And this is the stochastic differential equation that we end up with. So the thing that's got to do with the Brownian motion is exactly the same. And then we have a sort of dt term here, right? So we've got this, if you like, sort of bias term, or that's probably the best way to put it, sort of a bias term that, is kind of handling the effect of the mutation. And of course, if you took expected values of both sides here, you would just get an ordinary differential equation for the expected proportion that would be exactly the sort of one that you'd expect. Okay, and of course, one thing that goes on in this situation is that you can have convergence off to some sort of stationary regime where you have, some big A's and some little a's around. You don't have to go off to fixation anymore in this situation. Okay. Selection's sort of a little bit more complicated. So the idea here now is that, remember, in the past, Zn plus 1 given Zn was conditionally binomially distributed with capital N trials, and this is the success probability. And so what you do is just make the success probability now proportional to this. And so if alpha is bigger than 0, then type A's have a selective advantage. If alpha is smaller than 0, little a's have a selective advantage. And then the failure probability, you keep it what it was before. And then you just have to do some messing around with just expanding out geometric series, or kind of a little bit of Taylor series type stuff. And what you see is, when you look at the level of proportions, that the expected change in proportions in one generation is given by this. And the great thing is, again, we have this 1 over n factor, and then the errors in this approximation, big O of 1 over n squared, so they don't hurt us. And so the resulting stochastic differential equation that you get, has the same term in the front of the Brownian increment, and then again you have this so-called drift term, this sort of bias that enters in this way. And here there's sort of something, where sort of the haploid, working with the haploid story does kind of make a difference. If we, actually sort of assign fitness to mating pairs, then, we'd get something that was a little bit more complicated than this quadratic thing here. And so, but, since I've chosen not to sort of talk about the diploid story, let's, we'll gloss over that. Okay, so Anand, sort of talked about, kind of a general story where you've got a whole bunch of demes, and the demes are of different sizes, and you have mutation probabilities between each pair of demes. One can do exactly the same thing here, but just for simplicity, I'll just suppose that I've got two populations that are of the same size, and then the sort of stochastic differential equation that you end up with, not surprisingly, and there should be dt terms both there. Sorry, there's sort of, is this kind of thing here. And again, if you take expected values, you'll just get ordinary differential equations that, look right? That it's just, you've got stuff going from, the prime population to the double prime population at rate beta and vice versa. Okay, so, again, there should be a dt there and a dt term there. Okay, and so, one can ramp this up to, a whole bunch of demes, and even try to sort of move to a story where you have continuous geography, right? So rather than just, sort of population sort of connected by migration, you sort of have population, that's sort of just spread out over a continuous geography. And, things become considerably harder and kind of technically a lot more interesting in that situation. Similarly, one can have more than two types. I sort of haven't really gone into the details here. When you had two types, everything was about, binomials. When you have more than two types, everything's going to be about multinomial probability distributions. But, the central limit theorem will work for them just as it worked for binomial probability distributions. And so, the whole argument will go through. And, I just sort of haven't kind of bothered to work through the details there because, it's sort of actually writing things as SDEs in that case is not really all that illuminating sort of in the probabilistic jargon. It's better to think of these things as solutions of a so-called martingale problem where, you don't sort of kind of, in a sense, coordinatize everything with Brownian motions. It's sort of like doing differential geometry where, once you start doing sort of hard differential geometry, writing everything in coordinates is not necessarily the best way to go. Okay, so let me just finish up. So, obviously I've just sort of scratched the surface here. And, one thing that I didn't talk about, although I sort of hinted at, was the connection between this diffusion forwards in time approach, or it's sometimes called the prospective approach, and things like the coalescent that look backwards in time. And for a long time there were sort of like formal mathematical connections between these things. I sort of showed that if you were looking at this, expected heterozygosity, that was something that looked reminiscent of things that you saw in the coalescent, and in general kind of higher moment type things for the neutral Wright-Fisher were representable in things that looked reminiscent of the coalescent. But then, sort of due to the work of particularly people like Peter Donnelly and Tom Kurtz, there's a wonderful sort of theory now that sort of really explains all of that stuff, from a way that doesn't make it look just like an analytic curiosity, but really merges both the forwards in time and backwards in time approaches. I haven't talked about what goes on with multiple loci and recombination. Essentially, that's something that can be also talked about in terms of these sort of diffusion models. You just basically have a Brownian motion for each locus, and those Brownian motions, don't evolve independently. There's some correlation between them due to the fact that you have the sort of correlation that Anand spoke about with recombination rates. And certainly something that I haven't talked about here is, well, the sort of some of the simplest PDE, the neutral Wright-Fisher one, that's something that we can talk about in terms of eigenvalues and eigenfunctions. But when you start even sort of introducing selection, that's sort of something where there's not kind of, you're not just sort of using sort of well-known special functions, and things get harder there. And in other circumstances, say if the population size is varying and things like that, you basically seem to need to do something like solve the PDE numerically, or there's things along those lines. And also for certain Bayesian things, you'd want to simulate the stochastic differential equation. So I haven't talked about all of the very interesting and important sort of numerical problems, and also haven't talked about how the kind of outputs of these models, which are essentially what they're giving you is kind of 1 point on a likelihood, how that's going to be input into statistical inference, right? Because if you're doing maximum likelihood, you sort of want to maximize over a whole likelihood surface. And so you're going to need to be, computing something for one of these models over and over again. And similarly, if you're wanting to do something Bayesian. And so doing these sort of numerical calculations efficiently is certainly something that's very important. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
Any questions for Steve?
She talked about some other kinds of coalescence, and she
Right.
said that they kind of, if the standard one corresponds to this, the others correspond to other kinds of Levy processes. Is there much done on that forward time?
Not anywhere near as much, but there's a famous or infamous 7-author paper that basically figures that out, and the authors Etheridge, who'll be visiting here, Blatt, Vakolbinger, Birkner. I've got 4. Anyone? Yeah. Who, sorry?
Schweinsberg?
Yeah, Schweinsberg. 2 more, right? It is 7 authors, I believe, right? Yeah. And so the thing that happens there is, as you sort of say, the role of Brownian motion is going to then be played by sort of something like a Levy process is the essential sort of idea. And you're getting something with jumps because the way that these guys are produced, the way that you get out of the Kingman coalescent world or the vanilla flavored Wright-Fisher world is where you have individuals that rarely have extremely large numbers of offspring, and so the way that shows up in the forwards in time model is jumps, and the way that it shows up in the backwards in time model is multiple coalescence or even multiple simultaneous coalescence. So at the same time you have 15 guys all merge here and 23 guys all merge over here, right? And that's so you have all of that stuff.
So I mean, just that you need individuals to have lots of offspring on short time scales on the coalescent, on the rescaled time. It can be everyone could have a very tight distribution of offspring on the actual single generation time as long as there's like time correlations over time.
Oh yeah, so that's of course. I don't know that would sort of involve you not just having sort of a Markovian model from generation to generation.
There's selections.
Right. Yeah, but they're well, there though. I mean, if you're sort of moving away to people having large numbers of offspring because of selection, right, then you'll get into yet another class of models, which is that instead of having this story where basically you've got things moving around in a Brownian way, what you end up with is sort of a deterministic trajectory with Gaussian noise around it. I mean, in a sense, it's a sort of a more boring model. But if you have really strong selection, then if it's advantageous, you're just going to zoom off the fixation, and then sort of around that trajectory, what you have is sort of like it's more like a classical central limit thing. If you sort of like subtract off that deterministic trajectory, then what's left over is just given by a Gaussian stochastic process whose covariant structure has to do with the trajectory. And so there's really not a lot of sort of papers in that area. Some guy called Norman from the early 70s wrote a couple of papers about it, and then sort of no one ever seems to have actually sort of followed up on it. And because this sort of story here, I mean, John Wakely has a really nice article about, as you sort of noticed, everything here sort of depended on this rather delicate kind of assumption that, the sort of selection was rescaling like 1 over n, mutation was rescaling like, and so you get this really lovely theory, but, I guess John Wakely's metaphor, is like the drunk looking for his keys, under the street light because, that's the light's better there. It's not where he lost his keys. And so, he, in that article kind of questions the relevance of a lot of this theory to many population genetics problems, just because, is it really the case that, you're in a world that, of course, obviously you haven't passed to a limit, but, you're working with, some specific population size that's finite, some specific, fitnesses, etc., are you really in a world where this limiting story has relevance? And so, it's always a good question to ask that.
Any further questions?
Okay, thanks.